Hello, good morning. All right, if you'll notice, we're going to do one fewer assignment this semester. The last 4 days, I apologize. I've been working on my final grades, submitting them. They're just about done. They will be done within this afternoon. And then I could throw all my attention on your school and on your class in particular. But I want to let you know that there will be one fewer assignment. We will not do an assignment on fighting the war or fighting the Civil War. This will be our final assignment that I posted today, okay, on the alleged causes of the Civil War. All right, so as I'm getting your names down, are there any questions? Any questions or comments? All right, so what yes, Chetney.
I found it. I was going to ask if there was a review up for the next test, but I found it.
Okay, good. Yes, so that will constitute, it should be your precise test. Okay. So yeah, if you can prepare for that, you should be able to theoretically ace the test. All right. And so yeah, and we will also, okay, I might even do it Wednesday. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it Wednesday or Monday. I'll let you know via an announcement. But we're going to, as we have done in the first two, we're going to go through the test. Okay. So we'll go through the test, and this is the last assignment. All right. So any questions before I dive into this assignment? All right. And so we're getting into the alleged causes of the Civil War. Okay. And I made it into a simple dichotomy.
Wait, actually, Mr. Cowell,
Yes.
it's for test number 2.
No,
Are we on test 3?
Yeah, it should be, hon. It should be for test 3.
I don't see it.
We did the War for Independence, the Confederation, the early Republic, with great man history of the first 3 administrations, the War of 1812, and then we did test 2. And then now we're doing the so-called Jacksonian period, Antebellum Westward expansion, and the arrival of the Civil War for test 3. Yeah, so I'll get on Canvas and I will check modules, but yeah, it should be that way. It should
Under
be.
modules? Yeah, because I don't see a review thing for test 3.
Okay. All right. So if not, I will certainly put it up as soon as possible. I'll put
Okay,
it
not
up
a problem.
today, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Chetney. Yeah, I'll put a note for myself right now. So if it's not up there yet, I apologize, as I want to give you more than ample time to prepare for it, okay? So I will put that up today if it's not up. Okay, and so today, yes.
Sorry, it is there. It's at the very bottom of the page under modules.
Good,
yes.
Good.
Okay.
All right, great. I was going to be disappointed in myself if it weren't. I thought it was, but I'm glad to hear that. Okay. So what we're doing now is we're doing a dichotomy between court history and revisionist history. All right, for the coming of the Civil War. With court history, the one that we learned as children, right? Remember, like a king or queen would go to his or her court scribe and say, I want you to write a history of my kingdom. So of course that person was going to select, organize, and present data that would make that person look wonderful, right? So court history does the same of the US. It praises the Union, right? Because remember, we're going to have a civil war largely between 19 northern states and 11 southern states are going to fight one another in trying to keep the 11 southern states and forming a confederacy or a confederation in seceding from the Union, leaving formally, the opposite of annexing, leaving the Union, okay? So obviously from hindsight, we could tell that the North is going to win. It's going to prevail, and the South will be forced to stay within the Union as it is to this day. All right, but they'll have to be reintegrated from 1865 to 1877 in a period known as Reconstruction. Okay, And in that time, they're going to implement the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment will abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment is really significant, I think, subjectively. It finally gives a broad, easy definition for citizenship, and it extends it throughout all the states, stating that if you are simply born or naturalized in any of the states, you're entitled to all the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship in all of them. All right. And then the 15th Amendment states that in specifically, because remember, we've gone over this like with the Dutch in New York, with the Romans, there could be different levels of citizenship in which you are enfranchised or integrated into the society. You could have your basic protections as far as your economic rights to property, to keep your own wages, etc. You could have basic protections under the law, particularly that's significant with us with our Bill of Rights and individual rights stated, right? And then you can have the participatory rights of actually running for office, electing people, etc., right? Suffrage. And so the 15th Amendment made it clear, in case it's not clear in the 14th Amendment, that all the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship are applied to anyone born or naturalized in any of the states. The right of suffrage, of participating in government, is included, ought to be included, and it shall not be excluded, no one shall be, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So obviously that was aimed in protecting the African Americans. The lexicon of that day was Negroes. All right. And so obviously the North is going to prevail. It's going to enfranchise or politically integrate African American men. Okay. And so some of the things that you need to recall, okay, is up to the Civil War, up to the 1830s at least. Remember, there was an implicit, not explicit, because you don't find the word slavery in the Constitution, but an implicit concession to slavery, right? It confirms that people's contracts prior to the Constitution of 1787 are to be recognized after the Constitution of 1787, including if you are contractually a slave, right? Remember, under English common law, it was in the category of chattel was the word, like agricultural property, okay? It also has a fugitive slave law, whereby it states that if anybody's under contract and runs away from one state to another, the other states are obligated to hand over that runaway under contract and put him back under his master, right? It also has a clause, however, that states that the issue of the slave trade, right, of the kind of a pulse and I'm thinking of the metaphor of like the human body, right, of the blood flow of slavery into the states, that it shall not be addressed until 1808, that there should be somewhat of a gag rule. You can't even take the floor and make any motions against the slave trade for 20 years until 1808. But upon the arrival of that year, they can, right? And so hence they can make a motion as of 1808, according to the founding fathers, to put an end to the slave trade, right? Another interesting thing is in the Northwest ordinances, right, during the Confederation, which lasted into our new republic that was formed in 1787, that the Confederate government ordained that in the future territory of the Ohio Valley, slavery, whenever though that territory becomes integrated and annexed as new states in the future, the founding fathers stated, slavery shall be prohibited in those new Western states. So notice, right, the founding fathers, pardon me, my child. Okay, thank you, son. All right, I'm proud of you. I have a 7-year-old who just received DoorDash. He's taking care of himself. At any rate, with the founding fathers, right? So there was an implicit okay to slavery, even with a fugitive slave law. There was a gag rule on the slave trade, but there was an opening for the ending of the slave trade beginning in 1808, right? There also was a precedent that they established whereby they declared that slavery was to be prohibited in future states, right? In the Ohio Valley, that is, when they were under territorial status, right? And so that's important to note for the coming generations. And then it was also, somewhat of a tacit, an unspoken rule is you didn't take on slavery as an immoral institution. That from early on, you had detractors and dissenters who contended, right, that slavery was an anachronistic institution, right? Like a bygone, like from the Stone Age, that it was not economically efficient for the simple reason that the slaves have no incentive. They have no wages, they have no opportunities for advancement. So you're not going to get the best wage labor out of them, states this argument, right? And then you could also take the route of saying that, those jobs ought to be given to white men instead, who could become sharecroppers and have jobs available to them in the South and have an opportunity for advancement. Now, don't get me wrong, it was still a very tumultuous subject, but at least you could take it on culturally and not necessarily fear for your life, right? But just simply taking the stance of it being immoral, right? And trying to impugn the motives, impugn the morality of the slave owners in the South. Those were fighting words, right? Remember the Code Duello from Ireland and the British Isles, brought over by the gentry class, according to David Hackett Fisher in his book New Albion, where he states that that Southern culture was laden with this kind of code of chivalry, this so-called code of chivalry, where you did not impugn the morality of a Southern gentleman, lest he feel obligated societally with his family and his family name to literally challenge you to a duel. Okay. And so that was a brave step to take coming up into the antebellum before the war generation, which they normally start around the 1830s in Jackson's period. All right. And so a lot of that is going to change. And that to me, I think is is important context. And remember also that we largely developed by the end of Washington's second administration, a two-party system. And neither of the major parties, whether it be the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans, or at the time of Jackson, it was the Democrats. They had truncated the name from Democratic Republicans to Democrats, and the Whig Party, right? Neither of them took a really strong stance against slavery. And so that to me, that's all important context to consider as we're getting into this. So I have an old painting here of an antebellum reformer giving a lecture. It may have been at a lyceum at this time, Lyceum. They were intellectual fairs that disseminated throughout the North in the antebellum period from the 1830s up to the Civil War of 1861, whereby you could go and pay a small fee and gain entrance into this fair, in which they would have experts, alleged experts on a myriad of subjects, come up and give a lecture on that given topic. And that will include abolitionists, those who want to immediately abolish slavery everywhere because it is immoral. Okay, so they were taking a radical stance for their time period. These abolitionists, speaking at the lyceums and printing their words in by way of or through the cylindrical rotary press, the new steam-powered machines that provided penny papers, very affordable, wide mass-produced newspapers. Okay, so through the written and spoken word. So in the antebellum period, the first thing that you do in court history is you try to convey the image of this antebellum generation being anomalous, being out of the ordinary, in that they were incredibly idealistic. And remember, to me, I just define that for myself as you don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be. and you want to greatly improve people, institutions, society at large, right? You want reforms, changes, improvements, etc., right? So I want to make some notes on this. So that's where I'm going right now, okay? Giving you a little bit of context and stating that according to court historians, and remember, you select facts that are convenient to your thesis. So they're looking for the romantic facts, right? Those who are engaging in court history and contending that the North fought a crusade, a moral crusade of which we should be proud to this day, to incorporate African American men into the Republic. All right. So before I go on, are there any questions or comments? Okay. All right. So let's see here. So for one, right, there was a romantic movement, romanticism in Europe, and it largely translated here into the transcendental movement. All right. So with the romantic movement, it was kind of a, a, a reaction to the Enlightenment. A guy named Coleridge said, "I, for my part, declare the world to be no mere machine." Because remember, the Enlightenment was all about science. Its epistemology, its way to knowledge was through the empirical method, right? The scientific method. Everything was seen to be in a deistic fashion, made by a clockmaker-like creator who created natural laws to everything, even human interaction. Well, to a large extent, Romanticism was a reaction against that, not completely, whereby they were into emotion, intuition, the irrational, like with madness or craziness, right? The macabre, like with Edgar Allan Poe, the dark side of the human heart and imagination and behavior, etc., right? So the Transcendentalists, they took this romantic movement and they made it into their own kind of amalgamated American philosophical worldview, whereby they stated, right, that it was, for one, I'm trying to keep this pertinent to the Civil War, is for one, they were anti-tradition and anti-institutional, okay, in their epistemology. Remember, that's just a fancy word for the nature and origin of knowledge. So the way by which you get to knowledge, right, stated Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and the famous transcendentalist of the antebellum period, was through experience, your own experience. Don't rely upon traditions. Don't rely upon your institutional leaders. And speaking of institutional leaders, is they were very anti-coercion of any sort. Some of them even taking it to the extreme of anarchy, where they wanted no government, no institutions that had coercive power over your mind, over your intellectual and moral development, and over your personal freedom. They wanted you to be free to transcend, the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where just you're just tending to your gut, your belly, feeding yourself, getting food and shelter, and just living your primal needs out, right? That they wanted you to delve further than that. So I think of like the pursuit of happiness, right? With Diderot and Condorcet of the Enlightenment, and of course Thomas Jefferson. The right to cultivate yourself to the utmost, to learn as much as you can via books and reading and formal and informal learning, but also through experience. They were big on experience, kind of like a predecessor to like the existentialists 100 years later, like the beatniks of the 1950s, where it states that, your truths might be different from my truths. So just go your own path through experience, right? And use all your senses and your intuition and so forth, and experience your own sense of meaning in your own life and what you're here for as a human being. And so I like to call them generically, with tongue in cheek, kind of intellectual hippies, if you will, the transcendentalists. But note, right, how this might transcend and might translate into abolitionism, because most of the transcendentalists were abolitionists, is they did not want any coercive institution that kept any man from self-cultivation, right? And enlightenment. And that included African American men. Okay. They also, by the way, they engaged in these utopian communes, right? These kind of hippie communes. So you look up Oneida, Oneida, New Harmony, Brook Farm, and they literally tried to form the perfect societies where they could do away with crime and disunity and conflict. And they almost put it into a mathematical formula. Certain hours a week where you engaged in an altruistic behavior, serving other people, certain hours a week with self-cultivation and trying to learn and read, meditate, a certain number of hours in, they thought there was something almost mystical about manual labor, right? And they even went so far as doing away with the idea of the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids, and not establish those in some of these communes. So they were very radical for their time period. These transcendentalists and other types of religious and other communes in the antebellum period. So note, I'm trying to make the impression, right, with court history, that this was not your average run-of-the-mill generation. They were very different. They weren't for just deferring to tradition and to their governmental leaders as far as what is right and wrong, what constitutes reality, what the ontology, what the purpose of life is for human beings, etc. They went their own route, right? They definitely kind of walked to the beat of their own drum, if you will. All right. So you had that going on. And then you also had, right, you had material changes that were going on. And then you had fraternal and other organizations, that were developed in response to such changes. So for one, you had, urbanization. Some of the cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, really mushroomed in size. A lot of people moving into the cities. In the antebellum.
Excuse me, Mr. Cowell, yes. Can you scroll your page down a little bit?
Sure.
So we can see it, please.
Sure. Oops.
Thank you.
Better? Oops.
Yep.
Sorry. Man.
Oh, it just wants to skip it. Right there. There you go.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
All right. And so no problem. And so you also had a large influx of Irish and German immigrants coming into the States. Many of the German immigrants went into the old Northwest, into like the Wisconsin and the Great Lakes area, like Milwaukee and Chicago areas. And then a lot of the Irish stayed in New York City and Boston, etc. Right? To such an extent that even the textbook, right? Alan Brinkley's textbook makes the somewhat joke that there were more Irish in Boston, Massachusetts than there were in Dublin, Ireland. And so, a large influx of immigrants, a large influx of people moving into the cities. So you had urbanization. You also had the beginnings of I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but the beginnings of mass production, industrialization, right? So you had, as early as the beginning of the 1800s, these mills in the New England states, right? Samuel Slater and some of the others who were beginning these mills or these early factories and the beginnings of, interchangeable parts and mass production. And what they're going to do is they're largely going to supplant the work of artisans or skilled workers. Think of it today, right? Like a skilled worker who makes one custom-made motorcycle at a time, right? As opposed to like a Harley Davidson factory. He can't compete with that as far as, efficiency and price. They're going to be able to pull a Walmart on him through economies of scale, right? They're going to be able to outproduce him and have a cheaper price for their products and sell many more of them and outsell the artisan, the skilled worker. So some jobs like the artisan, right, were now the beginnings of feeling precarious, feeling like they're losing their spot in society. They're losing their profits and their business. All right. So you had economic changes that were going on. So you had urbanization, you had the beginnings of industrialization, also commerce, right, really spread. Uh, New York started coming of age as an international depot, right? Including sadly the illegal trade of slaves, because we did end slavery shortly after 1808, and I mean not slavery, the slave trade, but that was going on illegally, and it was going on especially in New York City, to and from the ports of Manhattan. So you had commerce spread, not to mention you had infrastructure developments, right? According to the textbook, railroads beginning in the 1830s. Before that, turnpikes, public roads, toll roads, and canals. The Erie Canal, as an example, right? Connecting New York to the Ohio Valley. And so you're going to have the beginnings of people being able to have the incentive and have the economic means to spread their wings and sell more of their commodities to a further market, right? Because as economics is a very weak point for me personally. But just simply, if a market takes you weeks to get to, it's going to increase the price of your product by necessity. So if you have a canal now, access to a canal, a railroad, etc., it gets there. Your commodities can get there much more quickly, efficiently, and therefore more cheaply, and you could sell it at a lower price, and have a better opportunity to have it consumed. So at any rate, commerce is going to really spread its wings at this time period, for as an example of a change. Also, the beginnings of the youth um, moving uh, from their family homes into these workplaces, especially young unmarried women, young girls, adolescents. So the famous Lowell textile girls, Lowell, in Lowell, Massachusetts, began living in these barracks, if you will, laboring for very cheap, very low wages. These mill owners. Okay. So you have a lot of changes that are going on in the antebellum period, and they're responding to those material changes. So, what are some of the alleged um, problems that they're going to try to face? Crime, right? Um, Sewage and waste disposal, fire departments. So, a lot of just practical things, right? Poverty, like almshouses, right? Uh, like the Gospel Mission Place, a place to try to give food, shelter, and try to provide economic training for the homeless, to try to get them a job. And it wasn't always for altruistic reasons, right? There was also that motive to keep them out of trouble, to have them less inclined to committing petty crimes, etc. So you have a lot of fraternal organizations, right, that are going to develop, and then of course, right, you had the benevolent societies, and they were largely comprised um, of women, of middle class women, fighting against crime, against child labor, against prostitution, against alcohol abuse. All right. So, what are some of the reform movements at this time that kind of, developed? One I mentioned was the temperance movement. Technically, temperance is moderation, but many of them, that's a bit of a misnomer. A lot of the temperance organizations, like the Women's Christian Temperance Organization or Union, was actually just against alcohol consumption, period. So you had the temperance movement against alcohol, right? You had prison reform. And along with prison reform, you had reform for those with psychological ailments. Dorothea Dix, D-I-X, established a large spread chain of state, quote, asylums for those with like modern day, perhaps, diagnoses of like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc. Because sadly, before then, they were just throwing them in prison. In the New England way, you were dealt with punitively because you must have sinned, you must have done something to invite those demons into your head. All right. So there was widespread prison reform, and by the way, our nation gained fame, a little bit of notoriety with the prison reform and the asylums, whereby people like Alexis de Tocqueville traveled from France to come and observe it and write on it. All right. So temperance, prison reform, right? Um, a movement against prostitution. A lot of these are going to be revived in the progressive era, in the last decade of the 1800s and the first 1 or 2 decades of the 1900s. It's funny how certain themes kind of go away and then return. And not only that, with the progressive tie, is a lot of these reformers, right, were middle class, calling themselves middle class Victorian norms. And normative behavior, right, is a sense of right and wrong tied to ethics in society, as far as what's proper and what's improper behavior. So a lot of middle class people, like the old middle class, like the intelligentsia, those few who had somewhat of a college education, those who had a white collar job, like lawyers and journalists, and teachers and professors, etc., right? Doctors are going to kind of take the helm of some of these reform movements and contend, right, that in Victorian fashion, right, from like Queen Victoria of England, that there is particularly a high standard on sexuality. And so they were against, extramarital sex, and really keen on that type of behavior. So a lot of the reform movements are burgeoning or taking off in the antebellum period. So like I said, temperance, prison reform, against prostitution, for Victorian norms, right? Again, anti-crime, also abolitionism. And remember, abolitionism, the abolitionists, what was considered radical about them is our republic. I failed to mention this as relevant context at the beginning when I should have incorporated it as well, is we have a federal republic, right? So it's a balance of power between the central government in Washington, D.C. and the states and local governments, right? So Article 1, Section 8 says the federal government has these powers, right? But the 10th Amendment states whatever is not under Article 1, Section 8 and explicitly given to the federal government is reserved to the states and the local governments. So it's a sense of checks and balances, right, in Montesquieu fashion, in his Spirit of the Laws book. And so, no, right, nothing in Article 1, Section 8, nothing in either of the three articles, the initial articles on the three branches of the federal government, states that they can abolish slavery in any of the states where it already exists, right? But the abolitionist stated that basically, like William Lloyd Garrison, okay, they flirted with anarchism. Some of them went to that extreme where they said, you know what, we'll engage in civil disobedience. And in fact, Henry David Thoreau wrote on such, that there are natural laws to the universe, and a man-made government civic law sometimes gets it right and sometimes doesn't. And in the event of the civic law getting it wrong in violation of a higher natural law, it is your human and societal obligation and duty and right to disobey that law. Okay, So William Lloyd Garrison and some of those on the kind of far left, if you will, of the abolitionist movement, they contended, hey, the heck with the Constitution. In fact, Garrison, in one dramatic occasion, actually burnt a copy of the Constitution before a crowd, and they almost lynched him for it. So that was seen as a radical stance, right? They didn't care what the federal government could or could not do constitutionally. They ought to do it anyway. Needless to say, abolitionists took on slavery as an immoral institution. Okay. So they had the guts to do that as well. And then what we're going to get into is some of the more confrontational tactics that they began to use to really make waves intentionally, right? They were proud of the fact of the moniker of rabble rousers, right? And agitators that was ascribed to them. They were proud of that label. Absolutely, we're stirring up trouble, but we're stirring up trouble for the right reasons in a good way, because slavery needs to be confronted. Okay. You had health reforms. You could look up like Sylvester Graham of the famous graham cracker fame. And there were reform movements, right, for tending to, I think of like the what is it, the Kellogg brothers, right? That Kellogg cereal is named after. Having a grain oriented, non protein, non meat diet. Trying to go to the geysers, the sources of subterranean volcanically heated water, that it would have almost miraculous effects on a myriad of human ailments. Fasting, enemas. I mean, some of this stuff was a little bit bordered on the bizarre, but you still had these good intentions, and whereby they were trying to, to implement reforms that improved man, improved his health in this case. And speaking of which, also in religion, is you had the famous Second Great Awakenings. Notice I'm using the plural because it was very multifaceted. Okay, but I think of as one person, to kind of give at least one name to each of these. Charles Finney is a name that comes to mind as an evangelist. And what the court history books convey that kind of spread beyond just church reform and into society at large was humanistic optimism, right? Optimism, I think of like Pico de Mirandola in the Renaissance, saying that man could delve down as base of a low as the demons themselves, but he could also ascend by his own choice and good choices and good behavior. He could ascend to the level of the angels as well, that his destiny is in his own hands. So there was a lot of optimism about free will and about human potential, right? And again, tying it to the non-religious, some of the non-religious, commune movements, right? The utopian movements with those communes, right? They had this belief that they could perfect mankind, they could perfect society, get rid of crime, get rid of discord and fighting of all types, right? And heighten man's cultivation, his self-improvement, intellectually, morally, physically. All right. So all of these, and I don't pretend that this is an exhaustive source, okay? But I might end there in my present lecture on that topic, okay? As I'm trying to provide evidence to you to convey that this was not an average generation. This was an exceedingly idealistic one, an exceedingly brave one that really wanted to look at things in a new, optimistic fashion. All right. Any questions so far? All right. And so then polarization and confrontation in politics. First of all, right, you're going to have the development of third parties, some of which were distinctly opposed to slavery. So remember, as I mentioned, in our kind of informal two-party tradition, because you don't find it in the Constitution itself, right? But nevertheless, our informal tradition of two parties, they didn't tackle slavery in a very confrontational manner. Now some are. So you could look up the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party. All right. And eventually, in the 1850s, the Republican Party. The Republican Party is going to be against the extension of slavery into the West. Because as you see on this map, right, the Louisiana Purchase, right, rendered a huge swath of formal territory belonging now to the U.S., and also the Mexican-American War, right? They're going to, quote, conquer California, Arizona, New Mexico, okay, Colorado, Nevada, Utah territory. By way of an edict, we're going to claim with Britain, we're going to claim the Oregon territory as well. So through different means, we're going to acquire territories. But remember, according to the Northwest Ordinance, Northwest Ordinances, plural, there is a process, a methodical process that's to be carried out before new states are formed and annexed or incorporated into the Union. Okay, so until then, they're in a different status. They're under mere organized territory status. So the Republican Party said in those territories where new states will eventually be annexed, we're for slavery being prohibited in all of them. Okay. Then the radical Republicans, those are going to be the ones that are more like abolitionists. They're going to be less inclined to restrict themselves to constitutional arguments, right? Like, what do we do about slavery in Mississippi and Alabama, where actual annexed, established states have it, formally approved in their state constitutions. Some of the radicals said, we don't care. We as the federal government, in whatever form, namely most of them said Congress, or through some type of executive decree, or some through a judicial Supreme Court decision, should end it. Okay? So you have the establishment of the radical Republicans, and they began to coordinate with anti-slavery forces in the southern states. So for instance, there was a guy named Salmon Chase, and he coordinated with a guy named, like the boxer, Cassius Clay of Kentucky. Did someone have a question? Okay, so Salmon Chase of the Ohio Valley teamed up with Cassius Clay of Southern Kentucky and basically did, right, an anti-slave power campaign. To the planters, it was like a divide and conquer strategy. where they thought they were trying to stir up class war between the majority of poor and economically, moderately successful small cash crop farmers, white farmers in the South, and their rich planter contemporaries, stating, right, that slavery hurts the white man just as badly as it hurts the slave. That white men, in the form of sharecropping, etc., should be getting those jobs instead of slaves. So to Southern reps, right, to the lobbyist groups that were representing the slave power, the planters who owned slaves, right, they were very much threatened by this and angered by this campaign by Salmon Chase. Refusal to cooperate with moderate Republicans on economic issues unless they supported anti-slavery platform. Because remember, the Republican Party also is a Hamiltonian party. It's for America becoming an industrialized, commercialized giant. And it's for the federal government subsidizing, right, politically and economically assisting in that process of us commercializing, industrializing, etc. So they're, kind of later on, you could see this in the 1950s, as late, at least as late as that kind of the premise of like, what's good for General Motors is good for America, right? The Republican Party would say what's good for the Central Pacific Railroad is good for America. And we're going to subsidize the Central Pacific. So some Republicans were very moderate in their opposition to slavery. And some of the radicals refused to vote with them. Let's say for like import taxes on cloth made in Flanders, Belgium, or England, because they wanted American consumers to buy American cloth instead to help our textile industry out. Well, the radicals said, we're not voting with you for those import tariffs unless you take a stronger stance against slavery. So for instance, one example that immediately comes to mind is they stated that anyone running for an executive position, namely a governor, right, ought to give a promise that in his patronage power, his power to hand out appointed positions in his government, that he would only appoint anti-slavery men. That's one example of the radical Republicans trying to take a stand, a more of a confrontational stand against slavery in the antebellum period. Now remember, this is versus moral suasion. Moral suasion, right, operates under the assumption that abolitionists ought to stay out of politics because look at American political tradition. What has been the normative practice is compromise, compromise, compromise. And we cannot compromise. So what we need to do instead is stay out of politics and morally persuade Americans, right, of the evil of slavery so that they will put enough democratic pressure upon their elected reps to do something about it. So with moral suasion, right, you have figures like the Grimke sisters and Frederick Douglass. The Grimke sisters and Frederick Douglass, they went on speaking tours. The Grimke sisters were Southern girls that were a daughter to a rich planter in the Carolinas. They ran away from home and they told stories about how awful slavery was, as primary sources, as having lived it, having observed it themselves. Frederick Douglass, a runaway slave, has tear-jerking stories that he shares with crowds about his mother running away to see him when he was sold away from his mother in spite by the master, because his mother would not acquiesce any longer to the sexual advances of her master. So he spitefully sold her child from her. He has stories of like the story with a slave giant who had, he said, the mental development of a child. And he felt responsible over this large slave because he himself was very sharp. And there was a misunderstanding, and that large slave was shot and killed right before him. And so just tear-jerking stories, right? And so then you have also, of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe's, or it's E.E., I think. Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's an anecdotal story, I'm not sure on its veracity, but whereby Abraham Lincoln supposedly met Harriet Beecher Stowe, took her by the hands and said, "So you're the little lady who started this war," as an anecdote to how powerful this book was in shaming America about slavery. Like I mentioned, the lyceums were an instrument through which a numerically small group of abolitionists could have their voice disproportionately enlarged, right? For Americans to have to hear. And the cylindrical rotary press. So again, some more of the radical abolitionists, if you wanted to look up, the politicians. Benjamin Wade, Wendell Phillips, George Julian, Charles Sumner, as I mentioned, another big one was Salmon Chase, etc. And then also, I would say in its own category, literature flooding the South. Talk about confrontational, right? And I think of Lewis and his brother Tappan. Was it Lewis and Arthur, I think? The Tappan brothers. Wealthy industrialists in the North who utilized their personal wealth to flood the nation with anti-slavery literature. Then the so-called Secret Six. Funding, right? Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad, which of course was not underground nor a railroad. But a series of paths through the South, up into the North, some advancing as far as Canada. So Harriet Tubman, what was it, about 19 trips, freeing over 100 people, of trying to rescue slaves, right? Well, there was an alleged Secret Six senators, radical Republicans, who were funding and promoting this. And remember, according to the fugitive slave law, right? I mean, this is just the antithesis to that. Instead of returning as a constitutional obligation runaway slaves, which again was reinstituted in 1850 under the Compromise of 1850. Now, right, you have this Secret Six who are funding the Underground Railroad, encouraging the, quote, theft of, quote, chattel property. So all this as a case in point, right, that they are perceived as radical and confrontational. They're not following American political tradition that states, right, that you don't take slavery on as an immoral institution. You don't touch the constitutional argument that it was sanctioned by the founding fathers. Oh, and again, this is a little bit redundant, but recall that they stated that the federal government can and ought to prohibit slavery in the Western territories. Because for reasons that I don't immediately recall in too deep of depth, the Democrats of the South, right, perceived that the end of slavery in the West would eventually bring about the demise of slavery itself, that would eventually die out. They agreed with their Republican opponents on that assumption. Lincoln quoted others in stating that slavery could die out like a gangrenous limb once slavery could no longer spread to the West. And then, of course, you had polarizing events in the 1850s. And this helped just tip the scale toward war. So you had compromises that elicited rebellious and even violent responses, namely the Compromise of 1850 stated that California shall be a free state, a free soil state, but there will be a more strictly enforced fugitive slave law. And I kid you not, states like Virginia that had a problem with runaway slaves, they established direct connections to places like New York City to catch runaway slaves. There are even books and topics whereby informally it was called a kidnapping club in New York City. Kind of a network of police officers, private freelance detectives, people in the, I can't recall the exact department that was responsible for it in New York, but that particular department, where they had a system in which they would not only try to catch runaways and send them back, and they'd get paid for it. There was commission for it. So there was a nefarious, ulterior motive that was added to this, that you could enrich yourself from it financially. But also, in some instances, they were catching adults and children of African-American heritage in New York City, whom they largely knew and didn't care, had not been slaves, but just enriching themselves off it in this system. So it got a lot of publicity. There was a case in Syracuse, New York, A kid, I want to say his name was Henry Scott, was taken from his elementary school, and there was a big campaign to save him. And so it got a lot of negative publicity in the North. And a few states in the North even issued liberty laws stating that they were going to defy that fugitive slave law. Then you had the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1853 and 1854, whereby Stephen Douglas, not Frederick Douglas, not the runaway slave, but Stephen Douglas with one S, a white man, stated that, you know what, let's allow the state legislators themselves to vote on if they want slavery or not. He called it popular sovereignty. The people are in control. Authority rests with them. So let their elected reps decide. And some even wanted a referendum, just a popular vote of the inhabitants in that Western territory to decide for themselves. Well, they did in Kansas, right? Both sides contended that the other cheated in the election. Both sides contended that they represented the true, genuine government of Kansas. And as you could easily guess, one side prohibited slavery, and the other side condoned it and stated that slavery was legalized. It's going to succumb, the situation in the state, to an actual civil war in Kansas, known as the Bleeding Kansas episode. So compromise didn't work, in Kansas at least. So my point being, right, is events are happening in the 1850s that are almost forcing people to choose a side. They're having a polarizing effect on the public. And by the way, this again is by no means an exhaustive source that I'm going to list. I'm sure there are others that I'm not presently thinking of. The Underground Railroad, the caning of Charles Sumner. He likened the Southern planters to Don Quixote de la Mancha, right? Remember in Don Quixote, he becomes senile, thinks he's living in the age of chivalry and knights and the knights' errands. And in particular, he fights for the chastity of a woman that he dons as Dulcinea. And Dulcinea in reality is a prostitute at a brothel. And he's fighting for her dignity with a patron who's paid for her services. He likens, as a well-read, articulate, and sarcastic man, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts likens the Southern planters as Don Quixote, and Dulcinea is slavery. They think it's something bygone and traditional and even romantic, but in reality, it's nothing of the sort. So Preston Brooks almost beat him to death in the Senate chambers. And of course, you had John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He and only 19 men attacked a federal arsenal, took it over, tried to disseminate the weaponry in that arsenal to the local slaves to start a slave insurrection. And it didn't work. It didn't succeed. His two sons were killed. He was wounded, and there was a very, very publicized trial, and he was executed. But they have an anecdotal story. Again, I don't know about the veracity of just how true it is and accurate, but the anecdotal story that has lasted for so long, that he literally kissed an African-American woman's baby as he was going to the gallows to be hanged. All right. And then, of course, Lincoln-Douglas debates and election as president in 1860. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln stated, again, that the federal government has the power and ought to use the power from past precedents like the Northwest Ordinances to abolish slavery in the Western Territories, no matter what the people in the Western Territories wanted. Stephen Douglas, as an effective politician, appealed to their Jacksonian taste for democracy, right? And stated, well, what if everybody in Kansas voted for slavery? You on your own, unilaterally, as an American senator, would say no to their demand for slavery? And he said, yes, I would, because slavery is immoral and because we have a republic, not a democracy. And the issue of slavery should not be decided democratically. So hence later on when he was killed, right, by Booth, Booth said, "Sic semper tyrannis, may it always be such to tyrants." He was seen as the tyrant in many southern states who by himself unilaterally would prohibit slavery from spreading to the West, even if all the people opted for it in that territory. So he runs for president and successfully wins in 1860, and immediately 7, and then in the next couple months, 4 more. So 11 southern states claim they're gone and secede from the Union. They start claiming federal territory in their own states, the post offices, and also the military bases and forts. And then in Fort Sumner, on a small island off the South Carolinian coast, a gentleman refuses to relinquish the fort, and Beauregard and the Southerners of South Carolina militia fire upon him in the federal fort. Lincoln claims that he's just bringing non-military goods to the men at Fort Sumner, and they fire upon his federal ships. And thus begins the Civil War. Because, of course, Lincoln, in his first inaugural speech, states, "Southern states, please don't do this. I don't have the constitutional means nor the personal inclination to interfere with slavery in the states, in the established states where it already exists and has already been sanctioned. I just will not tolerate it anywhere in the Western Territories. And I will not tolerate 11 states leaving the Union without a fight." So for 4 years, we had a civil war, and Lincoln's Union, right, known, the euphemism was Yankees, right? The Yankees, he had about 3 or 4 separate armies. The biggest one and the most famous was the Army of the Potomac, named after the Potomac River in DC, is going to win over the Confederate 3 or 4 major armies. In particular, the most famous one was the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. And by April of 65, the North will get the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia to the Army of the Potomac, then at that time under Ulysses Grant. And within days of this surrender, Lincoln will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the famous theater. All right. Any questions so far? So court history talks about the evolution of Lincoln. By his own account, by his own claims, he was apparently, as a young kid, indifferent to slavery as a young child. His parents were part of a big schism in their church over those opposed to slavery versus those for it. But he said he himself was indifferent. He said he did custodial work at the church, and he would hear many abolitionist sermons by his pastor. And he said in years they eventually sunk in. He claimed to have had some epiphanies, right? Some life-changing experiences that are going to change his outlook permanently. So one is 2 trips, 2 business river trips. One along the Ohio River and the other one along the Mississippi, whereby he is going to see slaves shackled in chains, being punished, and it's going to allegedly tear at his heart and keep him from having sound sleep. He also was going to bunk with Joshua Giddings. And Joshua Giddings is as his friend and Republican Party companion is going to supposedly really exercise an influence over his ears and what he spoke to him week after week, year after year, as his bunk partner. According to him, the Dred Scott case whereby the Supreme Court under Roger B. Taney is going to state that a slave, first of all, is a slave, is chattel property. So you take your chattel property from a slave state to a free state. You take, for instance, a mule or a tractor from Alabama to Ohio. When you're in Ohio, it's still your mule or tractor. So likewise with a slave. So to him, that opens up a big can of worms of issues with slaves not being able to even be free in free states, right? And free territories. And then speaking of territory, Taney states that it is the job, the obligation of the federal government by virtue of the Fifth Amendment that the government is to protect our life, liberty, and property. That he said, according to the Fifth Amendment, it's the obligation, the responsibility of the federal government to protect people's property, citizens' property, including chattel slaves, in the Western territories. So to him, you can't end slavery in the Western territories with that huge impediment and that alleged obligation of the federal government to protect slave owners. So to him, right, with the Dred Scott case, it convinced him to get back into politics because he's going to lose to Stephen Douglas for senator after those debates. He's going to quit on politics for a short period. And this supposedly convinced him to get back in as a crusade. And then also the course of the war. Is it looks very dreary early on in the war, you guys. You know, the 2 battles of Bull Run, Chancellorsville, Shiloh was nasty. Antietam was a close call. Gettysburg would be a close call. And so that when he sees the tide finally begin to turn in the war, he sees providence. He sees God behind it. And so when you look at his quotes alone, he becomes increasingly, quote, religious or spiritual as the war progresses. He loses a kid, and just goes through a lot of suffering, physically ages during this war. So by the end, right, he becomes this suffering saint, if you will, who's finally has had enough. And of course, right, his Emancipation Proclamation. Now note, okay, the Emancipation Proclamation only declared free the slaves of rebels who would not put their arms down against the Union. But the 13th Amendment declared the end of slavery everywhere for all American citizens. So was there an evolution? And then his final speech pertained to Louisiana, whereby they were flirting with in the new state convention of Louisiana. Because remember, they're going to make the new southern states, once they're formally conquered, they're going to make them, put them back into territorial status, make them reapply for statehood, and make them approve of the 13th Amendment. Well, Louisiana is going to go further than that. And they're even going to flirt with the idea of giving citizenship rights to African-American veterans of war who had fought with the Union to help win. He gives in his final speech his encouragement to that idea and said they ought to entertain that notion of giving what he called the better sort amongst the Negro men the right to participate as citizens in Louisiana government. And supposedly John Wilkes Booth is only yards away when he gives that final speech. It was in DC or Baltimore, I can't recall. And states, voting for N-words, that man just gave his last speech. So you could almost make the argument that that speech constituted the cherry on top that got him killed. All right. Any questions or comments? Sorry I'm taking so long, but I hope you guys are learning something and you have at least a degree to which you find some of this interesting. Revisionist history says, come on now, it's not a crusade. It wasn't a crusade. They tried to make it into one by the end of the war, but it initially wasn't. So firstly, right, with Northern motives, they look at a long tradition of racism and indifference to slavery in the North, right, as well as in the South. So in particular, right, I think of like the Ohio Valley, Indiana, and Illinois, where Lincoln was from. Look up the Browning's resolutions. Stated that abolitionists as troublemakers will not have their First Amendments recognized in the state of Illinois. They're stirring up trouble, and therefore they do not have the First Amendment right to express themselves. And to his credit, Lincoln was one of the six that opposed it, but they passed overwhelmingly. And this is in a northern state, right? Remember, we talked about at the end of the War of 1812, they gave land allotments that had belonged to the Red Stick Native Americans who had chosen to fight with the British instead of us. We vindictively sold, and in some cases even gave away, some of these Native American lands to poor white settlers. And many of them moved from the South to take it. So now you're only a generation away from that, from Southerners who were transplanted from the South into these Northern Ohio Valley states. and they had not shed themselves of their Southern prejudices. You look up the draft riots in New York City. They attacked not only rich people who could pay a certain amount of money to have someone fight in their stead during the Civil War, but also African Americans, saying we won't fight or we won't die for the N-words. They even attacked a black orphanage and attacked children, black children, in this riot in 1863. How many states gave some citizenship rights to some African American men? 5 out of 19. That's pretty weak. 2 states issued referenda to let the people decide if they wanted to enfranchise African American men, and both states, it did not pass. I want to say Michigan and Ohio, but don't quote me for sure. So plenty of racism in the North, right? The Free Soilers. They wanted jobs for the white man instead of the black man. So they opposed slavery, but for the wrong reasons, not out of any kind of humanitarian impulse to help out African Americans. They wanted those jobs going to white men. So get this, a lot of the Free Soilers, where they wanted to have slavery prohibited, they also wanted to have black habitation prohibited. They wanted to prohibit the habitation of black Americans in their entire state. And then look up the Know Nothings. You guys have seen Gangs of New York, right? You see a lot of this. The Know Nothing Party, right? Very, very xenophobic, fearfully hateful toward anyone outside what they consider to be WASP Americana, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americana. So they were anti-Irish Catholic immigrants, anti-German Bavarian Catholic immigrants, anti-African Americans, etc. And look how many offices were elected, right? How many know-nothing candidates were elected into office in northern states up through the Civil War. And then also the quote, Copperhead Democrats, who stated this war is wrong. We should concede slavery to the South, and we should not fight and die for the black demographic and for slaves. And again, look at the popularity of Copperhead Democrats that continue to win office throughout the Civil War. Lincoln was afraid, you guys, even when the Southern reps left Congress, the Southern citizenry left the Republic during those 4 years. And so now he's bereft of them. He's got virtually a Yankee Congress, a Yankee constituency of Northerners, and he still was afraid he wasn't going to win re-election, that he was going to lose to the Copperhead Democrats. Okay. The Crittenden Resolution stated at the beginning of the war, we are not fighting against slavery. We're fighting against secession, against 11 states claiming they could leave the Union, period. So demonstrating more complexity to the situation. So this first one, right? Was it more a utilitarian decision that the federal government began to increasingly see the option of freeing slaves, and in particular, immediately drafting slave men as a way of winning this war? Divide and conquer? George Julian, Ulysses Grant, and even Lincoln himself have quotes, right, whereby they talk about the psychological and military benefit of doing this. Because now, right, if they free and draft the black slave men, now that gives the incentive to all the slaves in the South to run away or to rebel against their plantation masters and middlemen and overseers, run away and join the Union Army and fight for their freedom. So is it a divide and conquer tactic? George Julian's is particularly sad to me because he states, guys, I've tried to appeal to your humanitarianism in freeing the slaves and using them as soldiers, right, for the right reasons, that it's the morally right thing to do, that the men amongst the slaves, right, and freedmen for that matter, who volunteer to fight for the Union are going to prove their mettle. They're going to earn respect and prove their loyalty to this country. We're giving him that opportunity. Well, when he tried to convince the Senate through those types of arguments, it failed. So he says, now I'm going to appeal to your self-interest. The South has beaten us to the punch in issuing a draft and utilizing slaves to dig trenches and to bury the dead and to cook food and clean. He says it's just going to be a matter of time, and they're going to put guns in their hands to fight against us. So are we going to let them beat us to the punch there? And so now he's appealing to their self-interest, that it'll help them win the war, freeing the slaves and drafting the slave men. And Grant had a famous quote, Grant and Lincoln similarly, that if you send a certain number of tens of thousands of African-American soldiers down the Mississippi, it'll make the South tremble with fear. And they'll go crazy as far as fear of a slave insurrection in their own states. And it'll have a very effective divide and conquer effect on the South. So again, are we doing it for the wrong reasons? Right? The confiscation acts. If you look at those confiscation acts, they went by the old argument that slaves were chattel property and that the Southerners were rebels, not belligerents. Belligerents are members of a separate sovereign country fighting against you. And they didn't want to recognize that throughout most of the early parts of the war, including Lincoln. They said, these guys are traitors. This is treason, not a war between two countries, but a rebellion. So therefore, we have the right to confiscate their property once we beat them in battle. So looking down at this picture, like Benjamin Butler, he was a Democrat. He was a Copperhead. He was racist. But he, quote, confiscated slaves of those that he defeated in battle, right? And then he utilized those African Americans to cook and clean and do menial jobs. And sure as heck did not trust them with guns. Look up the famous 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, of, quote, colored soldiers under Robert Gould Shaw, SHAW. There's an old movie from the 90s called Glory. Awesome movie. Based, however, loosely or well on this story. And look at all of its opposition politically and discrimination that they faced. And this is in the North, you guys. This is from the military command of the North. Politicians of the North were greatly opposed to this regiment. The border states. James McPherson, in his famous book on the Civil War called Battle Cry of Freedom, he gives stats on how significant the border states were, like Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky, between North and South. And he gives quotes, right, from Lincoln, stating how important it was to have the border states side with him and not with the Southern Confederacy. So he gave a concession to them and stated that if they stayed loyal to the Union, they could keep their slaves. And even in one famous case, Fremont, John C. Fremont, declared slaves freed. The Kentucky diplomats went to Lincoln and said, "Is this what you're going to do now? Because if it is, we're switching sides." He said, "Oh, no, please don't. I'll remove Fremont from command, move him further west. I'll return the slaves to their masters. You just continue to fight with and for me." And then eventually Seward, Seward, who was a radical Republican who was chosen to be in Lincoln's cabinet, he threatened to quit, resign more than once. And he said he was getting disgusted with Lincoln and his compromises, that he knew he was moderate to begin with and never a true radical Republican, but this was too far with the border states. And Lincoln tells him, he likens his job to playing chess and says, "I must appear to be almost indifferent to slavery, or else I can't even win re-election in my own northern states." Then he states, secondly, "I must win the war, and I need the border states' help." But he says, thirdly, once I'm reelected and once it becomes apparent that I'm winning the war, right? He says, then I'll free the slaves. And the border states just don't know it yet. And he has a famous third letter to the Kentucky diplomats, I guess arguably in support of that claim, saying, "Guys, I've already given you a couple chances. I'm going to grant you gradual, compensated emancipation, a deal I'm not giving to the rest of the South, in gratitude to your help. But if you don't take it this final time, I'm going to treat you no different from the rest of the South, because I no longer need your military help. The tide of the war is turned, and I'm winning." And Kentucky still refused, so he treated them no differently. And he did support the 13th Amendment that declared all slaves free, not like in his Emancipation Proclamation that declared only some, only the slaves of rebels. So there's a child side in me that wants to believe that chess analogy by Lincoln. But I don't know. But notice, right? When did his Emancipation Proclamation happen? January 1st of 1863. Antietam was precarious, you guys. It arguably was not that apparent yet that he was winning the war. And that's when he issues it. So did he issue it more out of desperation, like Howard Zinn states, as a divide and conquer tactic, to enlist the help of African-American soldiers? Any comments on this, you guys? I know this was a pretty long one. And by the way, I have a couple names here that are a little different. Let me make sure that I have all the participants' names here. So those are the two categories that I have this in, okay? And in this case, I hope you don't mind, but I'm asking you to do both instead of just one, as we've done throughout the semester. And I can't get this done. There we go. So do you guys feel amply prepared to do this one? So the first one is court history. It was a crusade brought about by an anomalously idealistic generation that caused the country to confront the issue of slavery. And the good guys won amidst this crusade and ended slavery via the 13th Amendment. And it's apparently evident by demonstrating how out of the ordinary this antebellum generation was, how idealistic it was, how anti-institution and anti-tradition it was. And Lincoln, like character development in a novel, came around, if you will, just in time to become the hero of the day. Revisionist historiography wants to revise that and says, no, it was a lot messier and more complex than that. The North was laden with discrimination and racism and indifference towards slavery. Oh, and by the way, one other thing that I want to contend here is the faction thesis. Where did this go? Remember that in Madison's Federalist Papers, a faction is a group that shares the same worldview and or self-interest. So a teacher, right, in Massachusetts, K through 12, or a professor, likely might vote the same way as a teacher in Northern California. That what's good for one is good for the other, as far as what they do for a living. So the faction thesis states that the Northern reps were largely, as far as who they were representing, were largely bourgeois industrial titans, people from the city, right? Entrepreneurs, business owners, merchants, right? Selling this, buying it cheaply here, selling it more expensively there. And that the Southerners were largely gentry, old gentry, planter class, or parvenus, or like nouveau riche slave owners. Okay. And so that they wanted slavery because they would have an ally, that what was good for them economically in the future, right, as slave owning cotton planters, would be good for slave owning cotton planters in New Mexico. And they would likely vote as allies, even if they never met one another. And likewise, the bourgeois giants of the North wanted factories over in the West, and more merchants and entrepreneurs and mill capitalists and bankers, because what was good for them in New York City would be good for them in San Francisco, California. And they could vote as a voting bloc, if you will. So that's the faction thesis, is that both sides were so adamant about slavery either being prohibited or slavery being extended in the West because they wanted allies. They wanted factional allies, right? For whom the same issues would either hurt or help, and they would vote with them as allies. And remember, you get 2 senators no matter what, and 1 House rep every 30,000 civilians in these new Western states. And you get a majority, and you get to run government. You get to make the laws. All right. So are there any questions, you guys? I believe I've finally ended. All right, so this will be our last assignment. So you guys hang in there. Please do both sections. And then after this, we have the final, and that's it. Remember, you have an option to do an extra credit write-up. As I'll tell you via an announcement, if you want to make up for partial credit any of the older assignments that I have not yet graded, or that I already have graded, I'm sorry, please let me know via a Canvas message, so I know to go back to that list of graded assignments and find yours and give you partial credit for it. Any last minute news about your unique circumstances? Maybe you had COVID, something that you perhaps had already told me about by way of a Canvas message. Please remind me this last week, as I can keep that in mind in computing your final grades. But I'm proud of this late class because you guys, like I said, the other classes have had 7 days to do each assignment. And you guys have not. You guys have played catch up. And keep looking at that test 3 ahead of time. That's precisely what's coming at you. All right, so that's it for me, you guys. I'm gonna go ahead and call it a day. And I'll let you know by way of an announcement if I'm gonna jump right into test 3 video this Wednesday, or if I'm gonna wait till next Monday. All right, so are you guys good? Can I get a thumbs up anywhere? You guys feel amply prepared? We're almost done. All right, cool. I understand, Matthew. All right, so thank you. Yes, test 3 is the final. Yes, test 3/final is the same thing. Okay. All right, thank you. That's it. Thank you.